Well, it's great to be back in Toronto. In some ways, I feel like my life since I left politics has gone north-south. I've spent a lot of time in New York and a lot of time in other parts of the United States, and it kind of feels like I'm bringing some, my first college sweetheart home to meet my parents. So it's great that you guys have all been so welcoming, and it's great to see so many friendly faces in the audience. I'm going to start with you, Catherine, because if whoever meets me for the first time, they learn within 20 seconds that I'm Canadian. And then for the rest of the time I know them, I annoy them, and Ian can back me up on this, by pointing out all the other people who are Canadian, and often secretly Canadian in the United States. And you, of course, are an illustrious Canadian who lives in Texas now, working for Nature United, and one of the leading lights on climate change anywhere in the world, but especially in the United States. So we're proud of you as a Canadian. Maybe you can start us off by setting the scene. Where are we on climate change?
So I'm a climate scientist, and I'm not a climate scientist because I'm an environmentalist. That might sound kind of strange to you. But for me, for a long time, I was more concerned about the future of people on this planet than I was about the environment. And then, being a Toronto native, went to U of T. Just as I was finishing my degree, I took a class on climate change because I thought, isn't that interesting? And that class completely changed my perspective, because what it showed me is something that we all need to understand, and that is that climate change is an everything issue. It is a human issue, it's an equity and poverty and hunger issue, and it is without a doubt an economic issue, because our entire economy, and it's not too far to say our entire civilization, is based on an assumption that we hardly ever look at. The assumption that the past is a guide to the future. And today, it is not. Today, our climate is changing faster than any time in human history on this planet. And that's why it matters, because it isn't about saving the planet. The planet, some might argue, could be better off without us. It's about us. We're trying to save ourselves. And the only way we're going to do that is if we adapt as quickly as possible to the changes that are happening, and if we transition our economy as quickly as possible to energy sources that don't produce heat-trapping gases, and if we engage every other section of the economy, including agriculture, including infrastructure, including cities, all in building this resilience towards and transitioning towards a truly sustainable world. Because we still live as if we're on a flat, infinite planet, as if there's always somewhere to go to get more, and there's always somewhere to put our waste. But today, we really do know we're on a round planet in every sense of the world. What goes in comes out and goes right back in again. And so instead of having externalities to our economy, like Allison talked about, we need a truly circular economy if we are to thrive. And that's really what this is about.
So Catherine, you would be, and I'm not unbiased in this, I think that you're the most successful environment minister we've ever had in this country. Can you situate Catherine's kind of macro picture in the North American context? We worked a lot of this with the NAFTA negotiations with two very different, and you three very different administrations in the United States. How should the people in the audience be thinking about the climate opportunity in North America?
Well, first of all, I'd like to clarify, I'm not from Toronto. I'm from down the road, the Hamilton. I think that's actually a relevant distinction for those of you who are Canadian. It's like Detroit. Okay, so yeah, that's pretty cool. So look, the way I approach things is I've decided we have to talk like real people talk, and that's a really big problem, but I'm out of politics, so now I've tried to be liberated. I think we need to approach this like an elite athlete. So I was chair of the UN Secretary General's Net Zero Task Force with 16 other experts from around the world, including CEOs to regulators, to environmentalists, to scientists, and we came out, these are the criteria and standards you need to do if you're going to be hitting net zero. But the reality is we often talk about 2050, and it's funny because my kids say, aren't you all gonna be dead by 2050? And I say, no, actually, I don't plan on being dead, but maybe some of the other people will be. And actually, we're doing a pretty good job because climate change is having an impact on people all around the world. But we need to start getting more disciplined. And I know we're talking about critical minerals, get them out of the ground would be a thing. Don't announce, just announce them. But the thing is, so did anyone watch the swimming? The Americans, you didn't, but just so you know, we're kicking ass. So we we had our trials this past weekend. Summer McIntosh is 16. And so she has a goal, which is the Olympics and winning medals. And so she's been training for that since she's probably been about 8. And that's a long-term goal. But she didn't say, all I'm going to do is wait till the year before and do some work. She said, actually, every day, I'm going to have a long-term goal. But I'm going to have short-term goals. And I'm going to work with a bunch of people. And some days, it's going to suck. And it's going to be really hard. But I'm still going to work really hard. I'm going to innovate. And I'm going to make sure I'm meeting those goals. And by the way, the long-term goal is a stretch goal. If you're 8 and you're looking at what you need to be doing for a gold medal, it's a stretch goal. But the challenge right now with people, I think, is that, one, we haven't really figured out that climate change is a crisis, both a risk and a massive, massive opportunity, the largest economic opportunity ever. But we're not approaching it in the way that we should, which is like, yeah, this is flipping hard. And we're going to figure out how we do this in a way that we're actually making progress so we don't hit the Mark Carney-Minsky moment, and then we all are like, oh my God, the markets, we don't have an orderly transition. By the way, it's going to be hard to be very orderly. If we'd started like 30 years ago, it'd be a lot more orderly. But you just have to do that, and that's what the Net Zero report is about. So to do a plug for the report I worked on, it's about setting short-term targets. It's about having a baseline. It's about measuring progress. It's about reducing emissions, and guess what? Investing, going from dirty to clean at scale now. It's not like the Australians are quite good on climate comms. They said there's kind of a joke where there's an Australian guy, he's from Sydney, he goes to his friends in a pub. And he says, you know what, I'm going to do something that's amazing. I'm going to give up alcohol. But I'm going to do it in 2049 because I want an orderly transition. And then he says, and you know, I didn't really drink on Sunday nights often, so I'm going to get some credit for that. And then the punchline, and don't get mad, but then he says, and then I'm going to get a beer fridge that's going to be called carbon capture and storage. So that is a little bit what we can't do. So I think the reality is we just have to be accountable now, but see this as a massive opportunity. And to kind of go to what we were talking about, which is critical minerals, like, we got to dig deep, folks. Like, we have to actually get things out of the ground. We need to produce them, but I know Mark will say, we got to do it with Indigenous peoples. That was the whole point of the Impact Assessment Act. We narrowed the timelines, we shortened them. We actually said no stopping the clock for government unless you need more information. But there is a quid pro quo that you need to actually engage with Indigenous people at the beginning and figure it out right now, because otherwise, guess what? You will end up in court, and that will take a lot longer. So I think there's a massive opportunity. We could talk about the cost curves. We could talk about where the future is going and where the puck is going and all of that. But I think the reality is we just got to get on with things. And just like, no excuses, folks. Like, do it, opportunity, and seize the day, because guess what? China will exceed us. Everyone else will exceed us. Like solar, when you look at what's going on, and that's what I want us to do. I want us to be like a little less Canadian, more own the podium Canadian, and just like figure out how are we going to get there and drive action. Less announcements, more action.
So, remember that. So Mark, if we had been in a room like this, well, this is the kind of room that climate people and everybody on this stage has been working on climate change in a variety of different ways for a long time. 20 years ago, the consensus in the climate community, if I can call it that, is that we need to get the attention of people such as the people in the room. But there is also a downside to that attention. And as you know, and I'll be extremely diplomatic as I say this, our history of resource extraction projects in concert with Indigenous people in this country is checkered at best. So tell me about how you see this issue and opportunity, its upsides and downsides.
So I would like to announce that I am from the Ntlaka'pam. I'm a member of the First Nations, Cooks Ferry Indian Band, Central British Columbia. I didn't tell you on their Ntlaka'pam because I didn't know you could pronounce it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Ntlaka'pam. Try it.
Say it again.
Ntlaka'pam.
Ntlaka'pam.
Oh, that's excellent.
Thank you.
Okay. So I would like to point out, I've been here through the whole day, and what's fascinating about the conversation here is that this conversation is going on in Indigenous groups in groups larger than yours, where Indigenous people are all having the same parallel discussion in another room. So this question that we've been talking about, how do you engage Indigenous people for critical minerals? We have to get Indigenous people involved for saving the climate. We have to get Indigenous people involved in our ESG frameworks and the Sustainability Development Goals at the UN. But this conversation is happening in Indigenous people. They're not here, you're not there. That's the greatest thing that's been of impact here. I am here representing the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, which is a collection of 130 First Nations across the country. All of them have had projects proposed in mining, critical minerals, clean energy, energy transmission, over $100 million each. They've all got projects. And the questions that we have going in a room of 700 Indigenous people at the same time are, how does ESG work? How do we get our values material to finance groups to understand that we do want to be part of this? How do we extract the minerals in a way that, it was one of the speakers excellent said it before, you don't have to choose between environmental degradation and economic prosperity. These are the questions that we're discussing. Why aren't you there and why aren't we here? This comes up constantly. So the Major Projects Coalition has 9 projects that we're supporting right now. We are a support capacity organization. The First Nations will come to us and say, well, this lithium project, this German lithium company has shown up here in the Ring of Fire. Who are they? Are they trustworthy? Where do we find the capital to get this? Where do we find a lawyer we can trust? You want to answer that?
Well, my wife is sitting
Thank
there,
you. Okay. So these are the questions that are coming up from the Indigenous side. So there's a lot of the challenges. We all need to get in the same room. The coalition puts on an annual conference. We have one coming up in April, 25th, 26th. It is a point where Indigenous people lead the discussion with industry partners to say, okay, what are we going to do to make this work? 2 years ago, our topic, ESG frameworks. ESG has come up in Indigenous communities because what's happened is that proponents are showing up in communities saying, don't worry, we have a SASB framework. We are following TFCD. We're fine, we got your interests in place. We looked into it, guess what? There's no Indigenous involvement in setting any of the standards, with the exception of GRI, which has a clause in it that says Indigenous interests are only material should there be a court case launched. So guess what? You show up as a proponent, first thing I got to do is get on the phone and launch a stalling tactic. How's that going to affect the climate? How's that going to affect the Canadian economy? How's that going to affect that proponent's ability to raise capital? That was 2 years ago. Mark Carney was our keynote speaker, speaking about values. Last year, net zero by 2050, 1,300 people showed up. Our keynote speaker, the US Secretary of Energy, who was phenomenal, who was born in British Columbia. Her staff warned me 3 times before I got her on stage, do not mention the secretary was born out of the country. And the first thing she does when she gets up after introduces goes, you forgot to say I was born in Canada. And if you watch the video of it, I stall for a moment, and the first thing going through my mind is like, ma'am, you can't say that.
Blame the staff, Mark. It always works. Blame the staff.
So, but at that conference, Net Zero by 2050, the questions that were raised were exactly what was talked about. How do we get to market? How do we do this in a way that doesn't damage the culture, damage the environment? How do we make these happen? So this year, we are doing one called the Values-Driven Economy, which at the end of the Net Zero by 2050 conference, people commented saying, this is great. This is all about the why we need to do it, and there's been a lot of why discussed here, but how? How do you include Indigenous people in a substantive way that benefits not only the project and the Indigenous people, but the Canadian and American economies? Because we are Indigenous North Americans, we were here before the border, there is a flow of information among tribes. We had a lot of US tribes come to our conference. We had the speakers from the Navajo Power, they came and spoke. We had people talking about tribes, how do they build electric vehicle network charging stations and capture that market in the Midwest, coming to Canada looking for input. So the conference this year is about how, and I want to shout out, I know he may have left already, Enbridge will be on stage, the CEO of Enbridge, Greg will be on stage taking apart the deal that has 23 First Nations and Indigenous communities in Alberta taking a $1.1 billion equity stake in the pipeline system, which will eventually be led into carbon capture systems. We have an Indigenous nation coming from Australia. It's not beyond us to look to other Indigenous nations. They're doing a 62 gigawatt green hydrogen production facility with 25 million solar panels, 3,000 wind turbines. They will be the largest exporter of clean hydrogen in the world. They will take that apart on stage. These are the sorts of things that our Indigenous people are talking about. You should be there. We should be here. These questions are where we're going.
Well, and thank you for being here to talk about this, Mark. I can picture some of my American colleagues thinking, are Canadians really that woke? And I want to say that this has nothing to do with the culture wars or any kind of virtue signaling. In this country, it has been read into our Constitution, was arguably there in the first place, that if we don't do projects in concert with Indigenous people, those projects don't get done. And we have a zombie debate about this in the country for as long as I've been involved in Canadian public life, where certain interests seem to think that there's a magic wand that Parliament can wave, or a law that Parliament can create, or a regulation that Cabinet can write that would override the constitutionally protected rights of Indigenous people. It can't happen. So they're either done right or they're not done at all, and that's the way projects unfold. Catherine?
Yes. So actually, I just remembered that you asked a question that involved the U.S. because we have Americans here, and Canadians are very good.
There are Americans here.
There are Americans here. It's great. I mean, Canadians have a tendency to talk amongst ourselves as if the U.S. is kind of there, and we say the U.S. takes us for granted, but I think we kind of also sometimes we just navel gaze. So let's talk about the U.S. because I've been spending a ton of time in the U.S. And there's a massive opportunity with the IRA. I kind of laugh, like I was in Europe last week and like they were like, oh my God, the IRA. I was like, could you stop it? Because I worked really close with the US administration. From everyone from Brian Deese to Gina McCarthy to John Podesta, a whole bunch of people, many of them still there or just left. And it's really hard to get things done in the US on the regulatory side. And so the reality is the IRA is great, because it is going to bring down the cost curves. It's going to actually, first of all, help reduce emissions in the US, which the US is one of the world's major emitters, so we need them to do it. Is the major or China now?
Cumulatively, US.
Okay, so we have all the stats here. So look, I think we have to think of this as a big opportunity. But to the Canadians in the room, when I go to the US, no one says Canada. They might say, like, I have a friend in Canada, do you know them? That would be it, and then we kind of move on. And
like, you will know them, though. That's the problem. You will know them.
You know them.
Well, yeah, if they're from Hamilton. But so the thing is, though, I think we're going to all have to dig deep. Now, the good news in Canada, anyone here from a pension fund other than Allison Load? Yeah, well, probably. We got lots of money, and we have huge opportunities. But the world is changing. So I'll just tell you one little thing. Like when I go to the US, and it's funny because in the US, I think it was Jane who was up here saying, oh God, we don't know what we're doing, and we don't get the best people in. Well, you actually bring loads of people into your government, so you have experts. Like you have like Jigar Shah, who's like the Energizer Bunny, and you have like levels down. But in Canada, I think sometimes we're like, if only everything kind of just changed a tiny little bit. Well, guess what? Distributed energy is a totally different thing. And you can't just take $1 billion trillion and throw it into that. You're going to have to figure out how to get this money to go to smaller projects. And we're not, like with our pension funds who have great opportunities, like that's just a different way of doing business. So I think, though, like, look, I see a massive opportunity. And Canada and US, we are good friends sometimes, most of the time, but who gives a shit? I'm sorry, who cares? Because we do have to compete. Like, I'm sorry, you have to compete. I got back to my analogy. We all have to compete, but why not figure out what are the real opportunities in the US? And when I was also, I love everyone always talks about environment and climate change. I was also infrastructure. I wore hard hat. Like, we got stuff done. And I was like, why can't we do high-speed rail? We have so much money floating in both countries. Why can't we have electric vehicle charging stations across? Why can't we do way more faster now with an administration that isn't going to be there forever, and potentially a federal government, a Justin Trudeau government isn't going to be there forever? But I just, like, once again, I don't know why. Maybe it's just like the competitive swimmer. I'm like, just let's do it faster and harder and dig deeper. And that's what I would love us to do with the US. like, the US isn't gonna, by the way, just say, Canada, we love Canada, can we just go do projects in Canada? We gotta go down to the US and talk to folks and pitch things and not just complain. I know we can complain about things, and sometimes they have to not, screw us a bit, but we need to also like figure out the opportunities and put together deals and also think about this as a climate issue, as a justice issue, as a national security issue, as an economic issue, and bring in a broader group of people. And I think this is really important what Mark said, because there's a lot of people who aren't in this room. And I'm not gonna name different groups or whatever, but younger people also think about things a lot differently from us. There's a lot of people, entrepreneurs and business people that are making things. I have to do a shout out, GHGSat. Does everyone know GHGSat? They are the world's leader in methane detection satellite technology, and they're Canadians, and you should all know about them because we need to move from just actually making announcements and estimating things to measuring and action. And they're doing that, and they're a Canadian company. So I think there's these opportunities between Canada and the US, but it's not gonna be a conference that's gonna do it. I mean, good, conferences are good. Hopefully they're kicking the ass, and they make connections. But it's gonna be people actually digging really deep and saying, okay, the world is moving really fast. We're not gonna complain about that. We're not gonna be complacent. We're just gonna figure out how we do things. And I will say that is where Americans, they're just hustlers. Like, they get things done, they want to talk about deals, and I think that's the opportunity. Maybe government is sometimes a bit slow, but that's true on both sides. But I think this is an opportunity, and that's an opportunity for this conference. Like, it's to really bring together people, but hopefully get deals made. That's what I'm hoping for.
Catherine, I want to put you on
You have to actually, you say this,
Sorry.
it's very confusing for us.
It is.
Sorry, Catherine
This happens to
Hayhoe.
us all the time,
You
by the
can't
way.
hear the difference between a C and a K.
That's true. It's true. Catherine with a K. Hayhoe.
Thank you.
I'm going to put you on a spot a little here. And I think it's an unspoken tension between Canada and the United States that we're taking materially different approaches to climate change. And it came up earlier in one of the previous panels. We have a policy that's based around carbon pricing that wrapped regulatory and tax incentive policy around it, both to try and accelerate decarbonization in hard to decarbonize sectors, but also, let's be honest, to match some approximation of what just happened in the United States with the IRA. And we were late to that party, but came pretty hard at it, in my view, in the last couple of weeks. We in this country have a policy on the books that says our carbon price will go up to $170 a ton by the end of the decade, which has been widely celebrated in the climate community around the world. The United States, you and I both know their sub-national jurisdictional carbon pricing models, but let's just set that aside for a moment. The United States has a federal carbon price of 0. How do those things come together, and how might they pull apart?
So carbon pricing has long been recognized by economists around the world, including the economists who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago, as the most effective market mechanism to spur innovation in a clean energy and efficient economy. There are, I think the most recent count is 47 national jurisdictions who have some form of carbon pricing.
23% of global GDP.
23% of the global GDP. So we are not alone. There are many people with us. And even in the United States, not only are there sub-national carbon markets, but the market is operating with an effective price on carbon because of the regulations in place. And in the United States, for many years, there has been a bipartisan climate solutions caucus. There has been a climate leadership council with many large corporations who are part of that. There's been huge pushes for carbon pricing in the United States that just have not made it across the finish line, and the IRA did. So at this level, the two mechanisms look radically different. But when you actually start to drill down, what does carbon pricing do? It gives us funds to invest in climate solutions. So here in Canada, for example, we've got over $5 billion going into natural climate solutions. In the US, they've got, over $20 billion going specifically into climate smart agriculture. What are the partnerships that we could look at on the ground with real solutions, even though the support for those are coming from different places? And I'll add something interesting. So I live in Texas. And you may not know.
That is very interesting.
It is. Living in Texas is the best place to be a climate scientist, I can tell you that. Because if you can change things in Texas, I believe you can change them anywhere. So Texas has double the wind and solar energy of the next closest state, which is California. And how did they do it? Through radically different approaches. California took more of a Canadian top-down approach. Texas deregulated the market, created its own grid, and built out to whatever solar and wind you put in. So radically different approaches, yet when you look at it on the ground, there's the solar and wind popping up like crazy. What can we do with that? And in fact, Texas is now benefiting because all these corporations are moving to Texas because they have made net zero commitments and they can get the power they need in Texas. Not to mention that you can get a 3-bedroom home for under $200,000. So we often focus on the differences, but if we focus on what we have in common, if we focus on the opportunities, I think there are many more points of immediate connection than we think.
And do you think that the sinews are there so that these lessons are being shared between jurisdictions?
It's really hard to share lessons, and convening people is important. Convening people, like you just said, there's 2 different groups of people talking about the exact same thing. So ensuring those conversations happen across silos is absolutely essential because there truly is so much more we have in common than what divides us or separates us.
So Mark, why isn't that happening between the Indigenous communities and
This goes back.
you've got 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Part of it, I think, is that Canada has, we all have origin myths about how we come to be. Our families have origin myths, individually how we get the skills we are, and this country, Canada and the United States, both have origin myths. It's the frontier, it's the country was built by settlers, and Indigenous people were not part of that narrative. And then legislatively, just the Indian Act in Canada, the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the States, the different treaties or non-treaties in Canada, it just evolved and that we ended up with different origin stories. And now what's happened is that this is an us problem. In the past, it would have been, we need a railway. That's a Canadian problem, a Canadian non-Indigenous problem. They just do it. It was just done. But now, the issues that have come forward are an us question, which is why, even on the Indigenous side, I'll tell you what the main theme on Indigenous meetings like this are, is how do we get non-Indigenous people to listen? Right? And that's kind of what everybody in the room has been, how do we get those other people involved? These other people are trying to get into the conversation, and that hasn't happened.
So we have, the time has flown by, and I do not want to go over our time. So I'm going to give each of you a good minute to a minute and a half to tell me what makes you most optimistic about where we find ourselves in the arc of the development of the climate issue, and what worries you most. Mark, do you want to start?
My organization, and there's others in this country, First Nations Major Projects Coalition of 130 First Nations. We will convene 1,300 people in April. We do that every year on exactly these issues, but it's half Indigenous, half not. Organizations like that are happening, and we need to have that sort of mentality in groups like this and ours. There's other groups in Canada, Reconciliation and Responsible Investment Initiative, which is a Canadian-based group that collects the proxy votes of Indigenous shareholders. Think of that, shareholders, investors, to vote better policies so non-Indigenous capital markets will hear us. That's happening, so that's going on. Second thing, I know it's quick, I have 30 seconds. No, I can tell you, I'll do it. In the United States, there's a group called First Peoples Worldwide. They were our co-partner last year, were very instrumental in helping us get the US Secretary of Energy and the US tribal participants. They do the same things, trying to raise Indigenous issues for the benefit of capital markets. There's a benefit in this. We will, as Catherine pointed out, we will not get this done unless we do it all together. And one last thing. The access to capital, affordable capital by Indigenous people is required to have Indigenous people as co-owners of the infrastructure, the power generation, the results that come from this. Ontario, just as an example, has initiated a policy of 50% co-ownership of all new infrastructure builds in power. The grid will have to be doubled in size. If only there was a bank at First Canadian Place who could help Indigenous people raise the billions of dollars, Darrell White, who could assist in helping Canada reach its climate goals. Darrell White? I don't know. Maybe someone should tell him.
I think you just did.
Oh.
Catherine Hayhoe, what makes you positive and what keeps you up at night?
So I speak to groups about climate change all around the world. I talk to healthcare professionals, architects, school kids, Catholic nuns. And the number one question I have heard every single week for the last 5 or 6 years is, what gives you hope? And so I've had to dig deep to find the answer to that, but I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt, I do have hope, and that's because the solutions are all around us, and they are good for us. A 2019 study showed that through efficiency alone, the US could cut its carbon emissions in half and save money. An Oxford study this year showed that the transition to the clean energy economy will benefit the world by at least $12 trillion, and the faster we do it, the more we'll benefit. A study by the World Economic Forum looking at nature-based solutions showed that there's $10 trillion and almost $500 million jobs in nature-based solutions. And climate resilience, those solutions clean up our air and our water. They make our cities healthier, they improve people's well-being. Oh, and they help with climate change too. So what gives me hope is the solutions are all around us. And what I fear most is that we will remain mired in our short-termism of the past. That's the way we've always done it. We just can't change. Well, you know what? We don't have a choice. If we want to survive, again, it's not about the planet, it's about us. We must change, but when we change, the faster we do it, the better off we'll all be.
Catherine, the floor is yours.
I almost want to end on that, but and since our name is the same. Look, I mean, the reality is it's exactly what Catherine said. Like, we have the solutions. What's so exciting is, like, we now have, I mean, of course we have renewable energy. We have big data. We have AI. We can actually measure all of these things. That we have, you know, people that are smart, that are innovating, that we have, like, you know, in a way, a national security issue that should make us realize that being reliant on fossil fuels is a national security risk. Just look at what OPEC did yesterday. Was it yesterday or the day before? I'm losing track of time. The reality is, it's like a no-brainer, as Catherine said. Like, imagine what you would like to have. Would you like to have cleaner air, cleaner water, equity, justice, national security? Would you like to deal with, like, poverty, you know, fairness? Like, it's all there. Would you like to have prosperity and growth? Or would you like to have this doom and gloom that we seem to not be able to really understand, although it's happening now? So that's what makes me excited. Like, it's there, and you've seen the cost curves go down. We have the solutions. The International Energy Agency put out energy efficiency, as you said, renewable energy, dealing with methane from oil and gas, not nature-based solutions. We know what those solutions are. Of course, there's some pieces we need to innovate. But it gets back to what we do the work. Like, it's not, you can't, it's funny because, I mean, I know I'm a bit, you know, I left government, but we would do announcements, and I would say, okay, I don't actually want to do another announcement until we actually deliver on what we said we would do. And I think that's what we need to do, number one. We need to not just talk 2050, we have to do it right now, and it's hard. But there's no excuses, because the payoff is so awesome. And we also need to deal with entrenched interests. And I know that's hard because, you know, people don't like saying that sometimes. But, you know, I'm just a regular person from Hamilton. And when I think about what is the problem with climate change, you know what it is? It's fossil fuels. It's not actually that hard. So the reality is there's no shortcut. And we can't talk 2050. We need to, guess what we need to do? Peak emissions by 2025. We need to reduce them by 50% by 2030. Probably most of you have kids here. You care about kids. You care about the future. You care about Indigenous peoples doing well because you're going to pay for it one way or another. Hopefully it's by them having good jobs. But we have to just be, like, a lot more focused and no excuses. Like, just focus on what you want as a finish line, and then every day you get up in your summer Macintosh, you do the work. You sometimes suck. Sometimes you make huge advances. You have people supporting you, and in the end, you win. And there is no better prize than a sustainable planet for all, which is cleaner, more prosperous, and is what we give to our future generations. I don't know how I can put it anymore. I feel like I'm like Catherine. We say this. We try to make the economic case, the national security case, every case. But in the end, you guys are leaders here. So leaders have to decide to lead. So that is, I implore you to look at the science, the evidence, the economic case, the national security case, and then lead and do the work.
That's a great note to end on, and right at time. So you may be out of politics, but you still know how to make a speech. Thanks, everyone.
All right, good job.